tell you what the Center for Cost-Effective Government is, if I might. When I was in government, what I found very quickly was that all of the gangs out there who wanted government to spend more money were very well organized. Whether it was a union, whether it was the educational lobby, regardless of who it was, whether it was a not-for-profit, they had their system in place that would be at your doorstep as a lawmaker to try and get more money out of you. It's not necessarily a bad thing, there's money in the pot and they spread it out, but there was no real advocacy group for the taxpayer himself or herself, because you were out there working for a living, trying to earn the money to pay the taxes to fund all of these different programs. And I quickly came to the conclusion that all the programs in the world don't mean a hill of beans if you can't afford to live here in the first place. And the other motto that I lived by was, you have to have the courage to say no to the things you want so that you can have the capacity to say yes to the things you need. But there was too much pressure and momentum within government to say yes to everything. So when I left county government, I decided that I still wanted to stay involved. After 26 years of all this institutional knowledge, I didn't want to put it to waste. I wanted to put it towards something productive and now just concentrate on that and not have to worry about potholes or snowstorms or anything like that. Just about the cost of living here on Long Island in New York State. So what we did is we put together this group called the Center for Cost-Effective Government, which is a cadre of probably about 200 of Long Island's most prominent business and community leaders. And we said we were going to try to create an entity that would counterbalance a lot of those big spending interests on the local level and in the state. And we looked at the property tax, and we started to ask, why are these taxes so high? What's the root problem? There's many of them. But one that is really a driving force are the mandates that are pushed down from the state onto the local governments. Now, when they put in place the 2% cap a couple of years ago, which I strongly supported because at least it forces prioritization, whether it's in a school board or a county or a town. It's not perfect, but it forces them to have to, cut some things out to get under the cap, which they wouldn't do ordinarily. But the state leaders had promised that when they were going to do the tax cap, they would couple it with mandate relief, because what they've done now is they have told the local governments, you have to control your spending, but they're still getting hit with the same pressures of the mandates from the state that they always did. So yes, we got the 2% cap. We did not get the mandate relief that they promised would follow. So these local governments are hemorrhaging. They're in really bad shape. And we're trying to go back to square one and say, what are the core mandates that we should go after? Well, let's look at what some of them are. This is a group that may be more educated in these areas than the average Joe and Jane out there, who aren't too focused on things. But even when I go to sophisticated groups, many folks don't know what the Tri-Borough Amendment is, okay? But the Tri-Borough was something very unique to New York, which is in the law going back to like the late 1960s when they did the Taylor Law, and then there was a lawsuit in the 70s, and then the legislature overrode that with the Tri-Borough Amendment. Here's what it says. When a municipal contract ends, the step increases that are embedded in that contract continue even after the termination of that contract. So what does that mean? It means, okay, the teacher's contract has expired, or whoever it's going to be, the municipal employee. There should be an incentive for the union to negotiate with management to settle and have a reasonable contract. But there is no incentive. And that is primarily because even though the contract has expired, salary increases continue. It's the step. People in the private sector don't even know what a step is. A step is an extra 2 or 3%, sometimes 4% a year in salary increase over and above the 3-4% that was negotiated into the contract. It's basically a bonus for being alive another year. Okay? So even though the contract expired, you continue to get that. Now, don't get me wrong. If a contract expires, you should still get paid for going to work. You should still get your benefits, your health insurance for going to work. But you shouldn't get a raise if the contract has expired. That's something that has to be negotiated. But because it's an automatic raise, management is frustrated because the union will just wait it out until management caves, and that's where you see these escalating increases, which is why almost all of the superintendents throughout the state want this tri-borough amendment change. We're the only state, or one of the only states, that has such an archaic rule. So that was one that we focused in on. And we incorporated into a bill, which I'll talk about in a moment. The second is something very particular to Long Island, and that is the outrageous salaries that are now going to law enforcement. Okay, you have in Suffolk County, it will be a very typical salary for a veteran detective to earn about $225,000 a year. Okay, this is crazy. This is absolutely insane. 26 sick days a year. 25 or so X days in between the shifts. 13 paid holidays. 6 weeks vacation for some of those folks who've been around for a while. You add it all up, it's like 100 paid days off a year with a salary that might be $150,000, $200,000 a year. Now, it doesn't start off that way, but it goes up very, very quickly. Now, here's the rub as well. And you've been reading about this over the last couple of weeks, and Newsday did a good job of it on it just a couple of weeks ago. The last couple of years, the last 3 years, in fact, is where they base the pension. So if the base pay is $150,000, they're allowed to put in as much overtime as they can possibly work. Maybe earn as much as $100,000 extra in overtime. And that is what they base the pension cost on. So you're not just getting a high salary of $150,000 a year, you're earning another $100,000 in overtime, so you're going off for the rest of your life on a pension that's based on a $250,000 salary. And this expose showed that there are 90 employees in the state of New York with a pension, not a salary, a pension of over $200,000 a year. About 8,000 with pensions over $100,000 a year. The median income for a household in New York State is $54,000 a year. That's earned income. And compare that to these pensions for some of these folks, it really is nuts. So we're trying to change that as well. Now, one of the distinctions between the private and the public sectors when it comes to pensions is if you're lucky enough to have a pension in the private sector, you'll typically have like a 401k, where you put in a little bit of money, your employer puts in a little bit of money, and then it goes up and down with the market, right? Not so with the public sector. By the way, the private sector, that's called a defined contribution. You put in a defined amount, the employer contributes a defined amount, but it's not guaranteed as to what's going to be there in the end. It depends on the market. Public sector, it's defined benefit, which means we don't care what happens with the market. The market could go up, the market could go down. If the market goes down, taxpayers are going to guarantee the defined benefit at this level. And that level is a 7.5% return on the pension fund every year. They invest it, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. When it goes down, as was the case after 9/11, as was the case in 2008, with the big recession, 10 years of growth dropped off in a couple of months. And the state would come back to locals, whether it's a school, a town, a county, say, make that up in 1 year. Where'd they go? They went to you to increase your taxes, do it. Or they said, all right, we'll let you borrow the money to pay that back, so they're paying it back with interest over 5 years or whatever. It's a killer. So what we've said is, look, the people who are in the system now, grandfather them. But for new employees coming in, they should have to have a defined contribution, just like the private sector has. So we as taxpayers are no longer on the hook for that pension if the market goes down. But these pension costs are really the straw that is breaking the camel's back. The obligations are absolutely enormous. And many states are not fully funded. New York is very plush with this money, but that's particularly because they keep coming back to the well, to you all the time, to draw from your tax dollars, your property tax dollars, to replenish that fund. It's simply unsustainable. And if we're going to avoid going the way of Detroit or Greece, there has to be a change. Now, I'm in that system myself. I put 26 years into that system. Some people will ask me, well, why are you talking about this? Isn't that bad for you personally if you change this system? And the way I look at it is this. I want that system to be viable in 30 years. I'm hoping to be around that long, okay? The way it's going now, it will not be viable. It will collapse. So it's really smart for people who are in the system to just understand that the taxpayers out there cannot be counted on to go back to all the time, to put more money in. They can't take it anymore. Everyone should put a little bit more in. That's the people who are in the system themselves right now to preserve it, change the rules so it's reasonable. Don't get piggish about it. You got a good thing, put a little in, put some caps on, and then it will remain strong for the next 30 years. If you keep going the way you are right now, it's going off a cliff. And then you go bankrupt, or you get a control board, and as is the case in Detroit, a court comes in and can start changing the rules and telling those pensioners that they're going to lose a lot of their money anyway. So it's smarter to make those reforms now. So that's the second thing, pension reform. Okay, the first was the Triborough Amendment. The third is putting a cap on these police salaries. The thing that has led to these police salaries getting out of control is mandatory arbitration. And that came into effect back with the Taylor Law in the late 60s. Why did the Taylor Law come into effect? Well, remember the garbage strikes of the 60s, if you're old enough to remember that, in New York City. And cops were going on strike, and firemen were going on strike, and garbage men were going on strike. So the state said, look, no more strikes. It's now illegal to strike. But as a bone that we're throwing out to the police unions, not to the other unions, just to the police unions, you will now go to arbitration if you're in a standstill with management. Well, they never anticipated what would happen with that arbitration. Because instead of these arbitrators balancing out and being the fair middle ground, they became advocates for the union personnel. So they would just look to see, all right, what did Nassau just give their guys? 4%? All right, Suffolk is up right now. We'll give you 5%. Then they'd go back to Nassau's when that expired. What did Suffolk just give? 5%? We'll give you 6%. And you had this leapfrog effect to the point where now, these costs are really out of control. They're unsustainable. Not only the salaries, but remember those 26 sick days a year I told you about and the 6 weeks vacation? If you don't use them, you don't lose them, as is the case many times in the private sector or in the city of New York. You bank them, and you get paid out on those to the tune of sometimes $500,000 as you're leaving government. Here's a check of $400,000, $300,000, just for your unused sick and vacation days. Why? Because the sick days might have accumulated 25 years ago, but you don't get paid based on the salary that you made 25 years ago. All of those sick and vacation days you banked, they all get paid based upon your highest step salary when you're retiring. That is what makes it so incredibly expensive, that's breaking the bank. Now, on top of that, some of these employees in the tiers early on, those who came into government in the 70s and early 80s, they were in tier 1. They get to take those sick days and vacation days and the severance pay and incorporate that into the pension. So now you had your base salary, and you had your overtime, and you had your severance pay, that may add up to a $500,000 salary, and you're getting your pension based upon that. So there is a professor, former professor from City College, who has a pension of $500,000 a year. Okay, a pension of because they were allowed to accumulate all that stuff. Now, here's the good news, but then there's bad news to follow. The good news is the state has recognized that, and years ago created new tiers. A new tier is they say, all right, we're changing the rules for the new people coming in. There's now 6 tiers. But along the way, they've taken out that severance pay from being incorporated in for these newer employees. And just a couple of years ago, with Tier 5 and Tier 6, the state legislature said that overtime will be limited for the pension for the new employees. Here's the problem, the bad news. It's only for new employees. We will not feel the effect of that for 20 or 30 years down the road. By that time, you know how many public employees will be retiring under the old rules that they can continue to heap the overtime into the system? This $150,000 pension, folks, it's not an anomaly. That's going to become more and more the norm. So what we've done in the Center for Cost-Effective Government is gone to our champion, who is Assemblyman Mike Fitzpatrick, a true fiscal conservative from Smithtown. And Mike, at our request, with us helping his people draft the bill, have drafted 2 major bills. One is the mandate relief bill. It's A4867. And that is the bill that will do 3 things with mandates. End the Triborough Amendment and the automatic steps. End defined benefit pensions for the new employees. They'll have to go to defined contribution. And put a 2% cap on mandatory arbitration awards. So if there's going to be an award from an arbitrator, no more than 2% salary increase for law enforcement officials on Long Island and throughout the state, if they have mandatory arbitration in that particular area. And the beauty of that is that, you know, we'll no longer see these outrageous increases on top of the already high salary. But there's another bill that we have. It's not in that same bill. This is a separate bill that would go for a constitutional amendment to take overtime out of the equation on the pension for existing employees. That's huge, because we don't want to wait 20 or 30 years before we feel the impact. We want to change that now so that starting next year, when someone retires, hey, you get your pension, it's based on your base salary, but not with all the overtime and not with all the severance pay on it. We have to get a constitutional amendment to make that happen. But it's very, very important. It's very, very hard to do because these legislators, they're in the pockets of a lot of these municipal unions. They have very little backbone to stand up to these special interests. But if you want to know what's breaking the back of the taxpayer, it's these things. You have to know what the problem is before you can fashion the solution. Those items are the main problem that are driving up our property taxes. Now, another thing, of course, is a myriad of taxing jurisdictions that we have here on Long Island, all the different fiefdoms. You know, a lot of people talk about consolidation, but it's such a heavy political lift. People talk about consolidation as being a good thing as long as it's in the abstract and it's generic, but when they talk about their own district, they don't want to consolidate, okay? So what we've said instead is look at something more politically palatable, and that is go toward items that school districts and towns and fire departments are buying all the time or providing services for all the time. And let's do them together, you know, en masse, okay? At 4 items we identified that every district has to do: transportation, security, buildings and ground, and some kind of cafeteria, okay? Why couldn't we have, even if you don't do the whole county-wide, let's look at Suffolk. Suffolk's got 10 different towns. What if you took all of the school districts in one town, be it Islip or Babylon, and had them bid out their transportation services or their buildings and grounds or their security to one entity, all right? You'd get economies of scale, you'd save a lot of money, and you wouldn't have to give up your school board, You wouldn't have to give up your school colors. You wouldn't have to give up all of the fiefdoms that have been developed and everybody is so careful about securing, you know. So that's one of the things that we're doing through our center to try to encourage that type of consortium purchases, right? So the other bill I wanted to talk to you about that we have in right now is reforming the BOCES process. Now, very few people knew about this. People know about BOCES and that you can buy stuff through BOCES. Here's the catch. It's not always cheaper to go through BOCES. In fact, it's often more expensive to go through BOCES. So why do schools continue to buy through BOCES if they can buy a desk or a chair or a conference table cheaper from putting out a bid from the local area? Here's the reason. Because if you go through BOCES, you get state reimbursement. And if you go through the bid where you get it lower from someplace out of BOCES, you get no reimbursement. So you could have a scenario where a school wants to buy a $1,000 conference table, long conference table. They can get $1,000 or $1,200 from BOCES. But if you go out and do some bids locally, you might be able to get it for $700. Now, wouldn't it make sense to buy it for $700? Well, they're not going to do that. Why? Because they're getting $500 reimbursement from the state if they buy the desk or the conference table through BOCES. So let's see, cost $1,000, I'm getting $500, my net is $500. If I go to Joe's conference tables, I'm paying $700, okay? So they're buying it through BOCES, more expensive, and the taxpayer makes up that difference. It's crazy. So we now have a bill, and then we thank the Long Island Business News. They did a big expose on this, and Channel 4 just did something on this as well. But we got Senator Phil Boyle to put in a bill, and I'm happy to say that Assemblywoman Crystal Peoples-Stokes from the Bronx is putting it in the Assembly, and we think we're going to get this passed, which will now allow for school districts to get the reimbursement regardless of where they buy that good from. So the cheapest place they can get it, they should go and buy it there, and they'll get the reimbursement. So that's something I think is going to pass this particular session through our center. That's some of the things we do. The last bill I wanted to talk to you about was the bond voting that is happening now with a lot of our schools. Because of the cap, a lot of these schools are starting to do some creative stuff to get around it. And they're starting to bond more. And they put out a bond because that's not going to be considered operational cost that has to come under the cap. So you'll see a big bond resolution come out in December or January. Why? Because all the seniors are maybe in Florida, okay, who might vote no. But they have these votes really at the, late when nobody's really seeing it. They sneak it through. They get all of their people down there to pass it. So we have a bill in now to say no more separate day bond votes. If you're going to have a vote for a bond, you do it on the same day you have your budget vote. This way you're clear with people. You're telling them, this is our budget. This is what we're bonding. It's up to you when you're coming out for the budget vote. If you want to vote for the bond and do these extra things, you can do it. If you don't, you vote no. But we're not going to sneak this in after we do the budget and then, oh, look, we can get around the budget cap now by bonding all this other stuff. So be on the lookout for that. That's being drafted right now, also from Senator Boyle. So we got a lot of good bills out there, 4 in all. 1, the mandate relief package, which has to do with the tri-borough and the cap on the arbitration and the pension. 2, getting rid of overtime that goes into the pension. That's a separate constitutional amendment that we're putting through. 3, the BOCES reform. And 4, the same-day budget vote on the bonding. That's been taking up a lot of our time in the center, but it's something that we think is worth concentrating on, okay? On another note, before I wrap it up, I want to invite you folks, but we do ask you to RSVP if you want to come. Our Center for Cost-Effective Government is having our quarterly meeting on April 28th at Madison Steakhouse in Motor Parkway in Hauppauge. on April 28th at 6 o'clock, 6 to 8. It's a free buffet and a cash bar. You're all welcome to come by, but we do ask that you RSVP to us because we have limited seating, but there's no charge. You can feel free to come. We're being joined by the Conservative Society for Action, Tax PAC, and Long Islanders for Tax Relief. And, maybe this organization wants to be a sponsor as well. You don't have to pay money to be a sponsor, but, just go on our letterhead saying you're going to be part of it. We're going to have some guest speakers from a group called Reclaim New York. It is a recently formed not-for-profit from some people with some deep pockets. I don't know if you recall a group called Save New York about 4 years ago. When Cuomo was putting out his first budget, which was a pretty good budget, the first one that he had. He since went astray on some of his budgets, but it was a tight budget. It also incorporated the 2% cap. He had this Save New York group that put out $17 million in counterbalancing the SEIU, the liberal unions, the CSEA, and the hospital council, all these guys who would normally fight any kinds of cost controls in the budget, and they were very successful, this Save New York crowd. They since went to the wayside. This Reclaim New York is now trying to do that same type of thing, raise money and help foster fiscally conservative principles to pass. And that means supporting candidates who are going to be fiscally conservative and going after candidates who are going to be throwing our money down the tubes. So that's a good thing. That's going to really help us change the dynamics of what's going on in state government.